The global economy rests upon a foundation so fragile that its fracture is almost unthinkable, yet its location is precisely mapped. We begin on the shores of the Taiwan Strait, a body of water that sees nearly half of the world's container fleet pass through its waves. This is the heart of the Taiwan Paradox, a small island that has rendered itself indispensable through sheer technological dominance, while simultaneously remaining the world's most dangerous geopolitical flashpoint. For decades, the logic of global trade suggested that deep economic integration would serve as a permanent deterrent to conflict. We assumed that because a disruption would be mutually assured destruction for the markets, it simply could not happen. But as we look at the rising credit default swap, CDS, spreads, and the tightening of maritime insurance premiums, that assumption is beginning to erode. The world is waking up to the reality that our entire digital civilization, from the smartphones in our pockets to the guidance systems of our defense networks, runs on a supply chain that could be severed in a single afternoon. We are not just looking at a regional dispute. We are examining the single greatest point of failure in the history of modern capitalism. The calm of the morning markets masks a growing anxiety among institutional investors who realize that the just-in-time efficiency we spent 40 years perfecting has left us with zero margin for error. As we trace the flow of silicon and capital, we find that the global economy is not just connected to Taiwan. It is tethered to it, and the knots are beginning to pull tight. If the silicon shield ever flickers, the resulting shockwave would not just stall growth. It would rewrite the rules of wealth, power, and survival for every individual on the planet. The gears of the global economy are greased by a commodity more valuable than oil: precision. In the Hsinchu Science Park, the air is filtered to a degree of purity that rivals a surgical suite. Here, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, TSMC, produces over 90% of the world's most advanced logic chips. To understand the stakes, one must look beyond the stock tickers and into the silicon wafer itself. If a disruption were to occur, it would not merely be a supply chain issue. It would be a total cessation of the technological frontier. Economic indicators already whisper of this fragility, while the VIX, the market's fear gauge, often captures short-term volatility. Long-term institutional capital is watching the divergence between tech valuations and geopolitical risk premiums. We are seeing a buildup of precautionary liquidity. Corporations are no longer just buying components. They are hoarding them, creating an artificial surge in demand that masks an underlying instability. This behavior mirrors the early warning signs seen in the 1973 oil crisis, where a sudden realization of dependency led to a structural shift in global power dynamics. Today, the dependency is deeper. Every modern industry, from high-frequency trading servers on Wall Street to the automated harvesters in the American Midwest, is an end user of this single geographic point of failure. The paradox lies in the fact that Taiwan's success has made it a target of its own importance, creating a strategic silicon shield that is simultaneously a magnet for global tension. As the cost of insuring cargo in the South China Sea begins to climb, the market is pricing in a reality it isn't yet ready to face. To grasp the magnitude of a potential shock, we must examine the just-in-time philosophy that has defined the last 30 years of globalization. This system, designed for maximum capital efficiency, has eliminated the safety net of excess inventory. In the United States, the average car contains over 1,000 semiconductors. A modern data center houses millions. The economic indicator to watch here is the inventory-to-sales ratio. When this ratio drops during a period of geopolitical friction, it signals a looming supply-side inflationary spike that no central bank can fix by simply raising interest rates. We are observing a phenomenon where physical reality is colliding with digital finance. Investors are beginning to analyze the geographic concentration risk within their portfolios, realizing that a single natural disaster or blockade in the Taiwan Strait could wipe out trillions in market capitalization overnight. This isn't theoretical. The 2021 chip shortage, sparked by a mere ripple in pandemic-era logistics, cost the global automotive industry over $210 billion in lost revenue. Now, multiply that by a factor of 10 for a total strategic disruption. The Taiwan Paradox is that the very efficiency that enriched the world has also made it profoundly brittle. We have traded resilience for margins, and as the spread between 10-year Treasury yields and high-yield corporate debt begins to widen, the bond market is starting to signal that the cost of this fragility is finally coming due. The era of blind globalization is ending, replaced by a calculated and expensive search for safety. The first signs of a systemic crisis rarely appear as a sudden collapse. Instead, they manifest as a slow, corrosive loss of confidence in the underlying machinery. In the currency markets, we monitor the real effective exchange rate, REER, of the new Taiwan dollar. A sharp, sustained depreciation here often signals that smart money is seeking exits, anticipating a regime shift in regional stability. But the ripple effect goes much further. When the reliability of the strait is questioned, the maritime risk premium spikes, a cost that is immediately passed on to the consumer. We see this in the Baltic Dry Index, which tracks the cost of moving raw materials. If shipping lanes are contested, the cost of logistics doesn't just rise. It becomes binary. Either you can move goods or you cannot. This mirrors the early stages of the 1997 Asian financial crisis, where a localized loss of confidence in the Thai baht triggered a regional contagion that eventually forced the IMF to intervene with multi-billion-dollar bailouts. Today, however, the scale is different. In 1997, the crisis was about debt and currency pegs. Today, the crisis is about the physical hardware of the global brain. Central banks are currently facing a liquidity trap of a different kind. Usually, they can stimulate a recovery by lowering interest rates to encourage borrowing. But you cannot print a 3-nanometer chip. If the supply vanishes, the resulting stagflation, stagnant growth combined with soaring prices, becomes an unsolvable math problem for the world's financial architects. As the crisis deepens, we observe the capital flight phenomenon in real time. This is not merely the movement of numbers on a screen. It is the structural exodus of the lifeblood of an economy. In Taiwan, the financial account of the balance of payments begins to show a massive deficit as domestic and foreign investors scramble for the safety of the US dollar. This creates a feedback loop. As the local currency weakens, the cost of imported energy, upon which the island's foundries depend, skyrockets, further squeezing margins. We look to the historical precedent of the 2001 Argentine Great Depression. When the peg between the peso and the dollar snapped, the middle class saw their life savings vanish in a weekend. In a Taiwan scenario, the paradox intensifies because the asset being devalued is the very thing the world needs most. We see a liquidity squeeze in the corporate bond market. Companies that were once considered the safest bets in Asia suddenly find themselves unable to roll over their short-term debt. Credit default swap, CDS, spreads for major electronics manufacturers blow out, signaling that the market is pricing in a high probability of default. This is the shock transmission phase. It moves from the shipyards of Kaohsiung to the trading desks of London and New York in milliseconds. The world is discovering that in a globalized economy, there is no such thing as a local conflict. When the world's primary source of computational power faces a solvency crisis, the global financial system doesn't just bend, it risks a catastrophic break at its most critical junctions. To understand how this shock permeates the global fabric, we must analyze the multiplier effect of a semiconductor halt. Economists use input-output models to track how a disruption in one sector bleeds into others. For every dollar of chip production lost, the downstream impact on global GDP is estimated to be tenfold. This is the bullwhip effect. in its most violent form. In the early stages, we see dark factories, highly automated plants in Germany, Japan, and the US that simply stop breathing because a single 5-cent component from a Taiwanese supplier is missing. This mirrors the structural paralysis seen during the 2011 Great East Japan earthquake, which severed the supply of specialized automotive pigments and microcontrollers. However, while Japan's recovery was a matter of rebuilding physical infrastructure, a Taiwan crisis involves the weaponization of trade. We begin to see geoeconomic fragmentation, where the world splits into rival trading blocs. The real effective exchange rate, REER, of major manufacturing nations fluctuates wildly as they scramble to secure alternative sources. Interest rates in emerging markets, such as Vietnam or Mexico, might spike as they attempt to prevent their own currencies from collapsing under the weight of imported inflation. The Taiwan Paradox ensures that no one is an island. Even a farmer in Iowa feels the shock as the GPS-guided equipment required for a high-yield harvest suddenly lacks the replacement modules needed to operate. We are witnessing the transition from a world of efficiency first to one of security first, and the transition costs are being calculated in real time by every central bank on Earth. The transition to a security-first economy triggers a profound shift in how we value national sovereignty versus global integration. This leads us to the onshoring premium, the immense cost associated with duplicating complex supply chains in safer jurisdictions. As the United States and Europe attempt to build their own silicon deserts, they face the harsh reality of the time-to-market lag. Constructing a leading-edge fabrication plant takes years and hundreds of billions in capital, a time frame that far exceeds the patience of volatile markets. During this gap, we see a supply-side vacuum. To find a historical parallel, we look to the 1970s stagflation in the U.S., where energy shortages caused prices to rise while unemployment climbed. In the Taiwan Paradox, the shortage is not of energy, but of intelligence. When the flow of chips slows, the productivity gains of the entire digital age begin to reverse. This is reflected in total factor productivity, TFP data, which begins to stagnate across developed economies. Central banks, particularly the Federal Reserve, find themselves in a policy pincer movement. If they raise interest rates to fight the inflation caused by chip shortages, they risk crushing the very companies trying to invest in domestic manufacturing. If they lower rates to stimulate growth, they fuel the inflationary fire. The result is a period of economic sclerosis, where the global engine is stuck in low gear, and the risk-free rate of return is constantly questioned as geopolitical variables overwhelm traditional fiscal metrics. The comparison with global case studies provides a haunting blueprint for what follows. We look at the 1997 Asian financial crisis, where a sudden stop in capital flows turned tiger economies into debt-ridden casualties overnight. In that era, the International Monetary Fund, IMF, stepped in with draconian austerity measures to stabilize the Thai baht and the South Korean won. But the Taiwan Paradox presents a challenge that the IMF's traditional Washington Consensus toolkit isn't designed to handle. This is not just a balance of payments crisis, it is a physical resource crisis. Unlike the 2010 Greek debt crisis, where the European Central Bank could theoretically print euros to backstop sovereign debt, no amount of fiat currency can manufacture a lost year of semiconductor output. We are moving toward a resource-based solvency model. In Turkey, we've seen how unorthodox monetary policy and a plunging lira can hollow out the middle class. But even there, the industrial base remained functional. In a Taiwan-driven shock, the industrial base of the entire world is compromised. The economic indicator that captures this is the cross-border bank claim data. As banks realize that their corporate borrowers are paralyzed by a lack of components, they tighten credit standards across the board. This creates a global credit crunch that mirrors the 2008 Lehman Brothers collapse. but with a critical difference. In 2008, the problem was toxic assets. Today, the problem is a toxic vacuum, where the most vital link in the production chain used to be. To further understand the gravity, we must look at the extreme end of the economic spectrum, the hyperinflationary collapses of Venezuela and Zimbabwe. While Taiwan is a high-income, technologically advanced economy, the paradox lies in how quickly sophisticated systems revert to primal survivalism when their core utility is severed. In Venezuela, the collapse of oil production led to a total evaporation of the exchange rate anchor. For Taiwan, the anchor is the silicon trade. If the export of chips is halted, the new Taiwan dollar loses its fundamental backing, potentially leading to a currency spiral. We observe the velocity of money as an indicator. When people expect their currency to lose value tomorrow, they spend it today on anything tangible, from canned goods to gold. This mirrors the panic buying seen in 1920s Weimar Germany. In a modern context, this translates to a global digital scarcity. We are not just talking about expensive laptops. We are talking about the real estate of the cloud. If the servers that power global finance cannot be maintained or replaced, the operational risk for every bank on the planet reaches an unquantifiable level. The world is forced to realize that the intangible economy of software and finance is built on a very tangible, very vulnerable foundation of physical hardware. The impact on the U.S. economy would manifest first as a supply-side earthquake. We often think of inflation as a phenomenon of too much money chasing too few goods. But in the Taiwan Paradox, the too few goods side becomes an absolute cliff. The Federal Reserve's traditional Taylor rule, which guides interest rate adjustments based on inflation and output gaps, would be rendered obsolete. If the output gap is caused by a physical inability to produce, raising rates only punishes the remaining domestic industry. We must monitor the Producer Price Index, PPI, for intermediate goods. In previous shocks, such as the 1979 energy crisis, the U.S. saw a massive spike in PPI that eventually forced the Volcker shock, where interest rates were pushed to 20% to break the back of inflation. Today, a similar move would be catastrophic for the U.S. national debt, which now exceeds $34 trillion. The debt-to-GDP ratio becomes the critical indicator here. If growth stalls, because we cannot build the hardware for the AI revolution, while the interest on our debt continues to compound, the U.S. enters a fiscal trap. The government is forced to choose between bailing out the tech sector or maintaining the value of the dollar. This isn't just a corporate problem. It's a sovereign risk event. The U.S. consumer, already stretched by housing costs and consumer debt, would face a purchasing power collapse as the cost of basic electronics and vehicles, essential for the American workforce, spirals beyond reach. The shock would immediately penetrate the American banking system through the collateral channel. In modern finance, corporate loans and complex derivatives are often backed by the perceived value of a company's future cash flows. For the Magnificent Seven tech giants, those cash flows are inextricably linked to Taiwanese hardware. If the supply chain snaps, the market value of this collateral evaporates. We look to the LIBOR-OIS spread, or the SOFR volatility, as indicators of interbank trust. When collateral value becomes uncertain, banks stop lending to each other, creating a liquidity freeze, similar to the 2008 GFC. In this scenario, the Federal Reserve might be forced into emergency quantitative easing to prevent a total systemic meltdown, even while inflation is rampant. This is the ultimate policy nightmare. We see the inverse correlation between the U.S. dollar and global trade volume breakdown. Usually, a strong dollar is a sign of U.S. strength. Here, a skyrocketing dollar, driven by a flight to quality, actually chokes global trade further by making it impossible for emerging markets to pay their dollar-denominated debts. This is how a silicon shock becomes a global debt crisis. The U.S. economy, despite its service sector dominance, finds that it cannot service an economy that has no hardware. The wealth effect reverses as 401(k) plans, heavily weighted in tech, see historic drawdowns, directly impacting the spending power of the American middle class. The government and central bank response to such a catastrophic supply shock would likely begin with economic statecraft, on a scale not seen since World War II. We examine the Defense Production Act as a primary tool for the U.S. executive branch. In a standard recession, the government stimulates demand. In the Taiwan Paradox, the government must forcibly create supply. This involves the direct allocation of remaining semiconductor stockpiles to critical infrastructure, healthcare, and national security, effectively creating a command economy for high technology. We look at the yield curve as a barometer for the success of these measures. If the curve remains deeply inverted, it signals that the market views these government interventions as insufficient to stave off a prolonged depression. This mirrors the war bonds era, where the state absorbed private capital to fund strategic survival. However, the fiscal deficit becomes a massive constraint. Unlike the post-WY era, where U.S. debt was low, the current starting point is precarious. We monitor the bid-to-cover ratio at Treasury auctions. If foreign central banks stop buying U.S. debt because they are dealing with their own domestic silicon-driven collapses, the U.S. faces a funding crisis. The Federal Reserve may be forced to implement yield curve control, YCC, artificially capping interest rates to keep the government's borrowing costs manageable, a move that risks devaluing the dollar and fueling long-term structural inflation. As the state moves toward a command economy model, the global financial system undergoes a process known as financial balkanization. We look to the historical case of the 1930s, where the collapse of the gold standard led to the creation of closed currency blocks. In the modern Taiwan paradox, this manifests as friendshoring and digital sovereignty. Governments are no longer content with the cheapest source. They demand the safest source. This leads to a massive misallocation of capital, as billions are poured into redundant domestic fabs that may take a decade to reach the efficiency of TSMC. The economic indicator to watch here is the capital expenditure, CapEx to revenue ratio for the global tech sector. When this ratio spikes while productivity remains flat, it signals a deadweight loss for the global economy. We can draw parallels to the 1980s Soviet Union, where high levels of industrial investment failed to produce growth because the system lacked the information efficiency of a free market. Today, the world is trading the efficiency of the market for the certainty of the state. This shift is reflected in the global trade to GDP ratio, which begins a secular decline after decades of growth. The world is getting smaller, poorer, and more expensive, as the Taiwan Paradox forces a retreat from the very globalism that defined the 21st century. For the individual, the transition from global abundance to silicon scarcity requires a radical shift in survival strategy. We must examine the real wage growth, or lack thereof, as inflation in durable goods outpaces income. In the 1990s, Japanese lost decade, individuals survived through extreme frugality and a shift toward defensive assets. In the Taiwan Paradox, the first rule of survival is asset relocation. When a systemic shock hits, the correlation between traditionally diverse assets often goes to 1.0. Everything drops at once. The practical insight here is understanding the liquidity ladder. In a crisis, you want to hold assets that are not dependent on a functioning high-tech supply chain for their core value. We look at the gold to S&P 500 ratio as an indicator of this shift. Individuals who thrived during the stagflation of the late 70s were those who moved out of paper assets and into hard assets, like real estate, precious metals, and commodities. However, there is a modern twist: digital resilience. As the physical internet infrastructure faces maintenance risks, the value of decentralized, offline-capable systems grows. The individual must learn to distinguish between price and value. In a world where a new car is unavailable at any price due to a missing controller, the value of a 20-year-old analog vehicle suddenly increases. This is the retro-economic shift, where simplicity becomes a premium feature for survival in an overly complex, broken world. The second layer of individual survival focuses on human capital devaluation. In an economy driven by AI and high-frequency data, most professional skills are predicated on the availability of cheap, infinite computing power. When the Taiwan Paradox interrupts this supply, the service-to-manufacturing wage gap begins to close in an unexpected way. We look at the labor force participation rate through the lens of vocational versus digital skills. In the 2001 Turkish financial crisis, those with tangible trade skills or the ability to produce essential goods locally maintained their purchasing power far better than white-collar workers dependent on a collapsing financial sector. The practical insight for the viewer is the reskilling necessity. To navigate a silicon-short world, one must possess cross-functional literacy, the ability to understand both the high-tech systems we still have and the low-tech workarounds we will need. We monitor household debt service ratios as a survival metric. In a period of stagflation, debt is a double-edged sword. While inflation can erode the real value of what you owe, the rising interest rates required to fight that inflation can trigger a cash flow crunch. The survival strategy shifts from growth-seeking to solvency-protecting. This means reducing high-interest consumer debt and building a buffer stock of essential goods. We are moving from the age of optimization, where we own nothing and subscribe to everything, back to an age of possession, where the physical control of one's tools and resources determines their economic resilience. The geopolitical risk premium we have discussed finally finds its most volatile expression in the real estate market. Historically, real estate is seen as a hedge against inflation, but the Taiwan Paradox introduces a cost of construction trap. In many U.S. metropolitan areas, the modern smart home, or high-rise office, is a labyrinth of sensors, climate control systems, and automated security, all reliant on the very microcontrollers that are now in short supply. We look at the housing starts and building permits data as a leading indicator. If the cost of the digital nervous system of a building triples, new supply grinds to a halt. This mirrors the housing market stagnation seen in several post-Soviet states during the 1990s, where unfinished skeletons of buildings dominated the skyline due to broken supply chains for essential materials. For the individual, the insight is the utility of the physical. Properties with low technological dependency and high resource autonomy, such as those with independent water or energy systems, begin to command a resilience premium. We are seeing a divergence in the capitalization rate, between high-tech, smart cities and more traditional, ruggedized infrastructure. Investors are beginning to price in the maintenance risk of a world without replacement parts. In a silicon-scarce environment, the most valuable square foot of real estate isn't the one with the fastest fiber optic connection. It's the one that can function when the connection goes dark. The collapse of the silicon piece forces us to reconsider the concept of the global reserve currency. For nearly a century, the U.S. dollar has reigned supreme because it was backed by the world's most liquid and innovative economy. But in the Taiwan Paradox, we see the rise of commodity-backed realism. If the U.S. cannot guarantee the flow of essential technology, the petrodollar system faces its greatest challenge since its inception. We monitor the Triffin dilemma in real time, the conflict between a country's domestic monetary policy and its role as the provider of the world's reserve currency. As supply chains fracture, nations may move toward bilateral trade agreements, using gold or local currency baskets, bypassing the dollar entirely to secure vital components. This mirrors the currency clearing unions of the 1940s. The economic indicator to watch is the share of the US dollar in global foreign exchange reserves. A rapid decline here suggests that the world is no longer willing to pay the seigniorage to a superpower that can no longer ensure the stability of the high-tech status quo. For the global economy, this means a massive increase in transaction costs. The friction of trade rises, and with it, the price of everything. We are witnessing the end of low-cost capital, as the risk-free rate is adjusted upward to account for a world where the most important asset, the semiconductor, is no longer a guaranteed commodity, but a geopolitical weapon. As the global reserve status of the dollar is tested, the Taiwan Paradox shifts from a corporate nightmare to a social contract crisis. We must examine the Gini coefficient, the measure of income inequality, within developed nations. In a silicon-starved economy, those who own the means of high-tech production or hold stockpiles of legacy hardware gain disproportionate power, while the service-oriented working class sees their tools of trade, apps, gig economy platforms, and digital marketplaces, deteriorate. This mirrors the hyperstratification seen during the collapse of the Soviet bloc, where red directors, who controlled physical assets, became the new oligarchs overnight. The economic indicator that tracks this social friction is the misery index, the sum of the unemployment and inflation rates. If the misery index remains in double digits for more than 24 months, the risk of civil unrest and political radicalization spikes. Governments, desperate to maintain order, often resort to price controls and rationing of electronic components. We saw this in the 1970s with gasoline. In the Taiwan Paradox, we see it with medical devices, communication hardware, and industrial controllers. For the individual, the insight is that social capital and local networks become more valuable than digital capital. When the global system fails to deliver, the local exchange trading system, ELETs, and community-based resource sharing become the ultimate buffers against a systemic collapse of the high-tech supply chain. The deterioration of the social contract leads us to the innovation stagnation phase, where the Moore's law of exponential progress effectively hits a wall of physical scarcity. In a healthy economy, the research and development, R&D, to GDP ratio is a predictor of future prosperity. However, in the Taiwan Paradox, R&D becomes a luxury of the few. We see a technological divergence, where the cutting edge is reserved for state-sanctioned military and intelligence projects, while the civilian world is forced into a maintenance economy. This is similar to the Cubanization of technology seen in Havana, where 1950s cars were kept running for decades through sheer mechanical ingenuity. In our case, it is 2020s era servers and medical imaging machines being patched with salvaged parts. The economic indicator for this is the capital obsolescence rate. When companies cannot replace their aging hardware, their productivity drops, leading to a profit squeeze that triggers further layoffs. For the investor, the growth at any cost model of the last decade is replaced by value in longevity. We monitor the refurbished goods market index as it begins to outperform new retail sales. The practical insight is clear. In a world where you cannot innovate your way out of a crisis, the ability to preserve and repair existing infrastructure becomes the most critical economic moat. The Taiwan Paradox teaches us that progress is not an inevitable upward line, but a fragile privilege sustained by a very specific and now threatened geographic harmony. The final response of the state involves the nationalization of knowledge. As the Taiwan Paradox reaches its zenith, governments realize that raw materials and machines are useless without the instruction sets held by a shrinking pool of elite engineers. We observe the brain drain as a primary economic indicator, tracking the migration of high-value human capital from vulnerable regions to secure sanctuary zones. This mirrors the post-WND era's Operation Paperclip, where nations scramble to secure the intellectual architects of the next era. In the United States, we see the creation of strategic talent reserves, where the government subsidizes the education and housing of specialists in photolithography and materials science. For the viewer, the practical insight is the escalation of specialty. In a general labor surplus, hyper-specialized technical skills become the only currency that retains global portability. We look at the wage premium for STEM in non-tech sectors. When a hospital or a power plant is willing to pay software engineer salaries just to keep their legacy hardware running, we have reached the repairman economy. The central bank's role here shifts from managing the money supply to managing the utility supply. They may implement credit guidance, forcing commercial banks to lend only to firms that contribute to national technological resilience. The economy becomes a closed loop, where every unit of capital is measured by its contribution to the survival of the state's digital sovereignty. As the state tightens its grip on the repairman economy, we enter a period of economic atrophy. The indicators of health that we once relied on, such as the S&P 500 or the NASDAQ, become decoupled from the reality of the average citizen. In this stage, we monitor the shadow exchange rate, the value of goods and services when traded outside the formal, state-sanctioned economy. This mirrors the black markets of the Soviet era, or the blue chip swap in modern-day Argentina, where the official price of a vital component bears no resemblance to its actual cost on the street. For the individual, the Taiwan Paradox transforms from a macro-financial event into a micro-survival challenge. We observe the barter-to-income ratio rising in communities where digital payment systems become unreliable due to hardware failures. The practical insight is the decentralization of wealth. Those who hold physical inventories of high-demand legacy components, routers, industrial sensors, or even high-grade copper, find themselves with more leverage than those with large, yet inaccessible, digital brokerage accounts. We are witnessing the revenge of the physical, where the ability to touch, hold, and fix a resource determines one's economic status. The central bank's attempt to control inflation through interest rates becomes a blunt instrument in a world where the velocity of goods has slowed to a crawl. In this environment, the most successful survival strategy is the microfactory model. Localized, low-tech production that bypasses the broken global nodes. The struggle for digital sovereignty eventually leads to the great tech bifurcation. We observe the emergence of two distinct global ecosystems, one based on Western standards and another on an alternative, often China-centric, infrastructure. This is not merely a software split, but a fundamental hardware schism. The economic indicator to watch here is the interoperability deficit, the rising cost for multinational corporations to maintain dual systems that cannot talk to one another. We see parallels in the early days of the railroad, where differing track gauges prevented a unified market. In the Taiwan Paradox, this schism creates a deadweight loss of unprecedented proportions. For the U.S. economy, the efficiency frontier is pushed backward as companies are forced to choose sides, losing access to massive markets and talent pools. We monitor the foreign direct investment (FDI) inward flow into neutral, buffer states like India, Brazil, or Indonesia, as capital seeks a middle ground that doesn't exist. For the individual, the insight is geographic arbitrage. Success depends on being in a jurisdiction that has secured its own micro-supply chain. We look at the energy-to-compute ratio of localized economies. Those that can power their own limited tech manufacturing through domestic energy sources become the new safe havens of the 21st century. The central bank's balance sheet becomes a strategic asset ledger, where the focus shifts from stabilizing the currency to subsidizing the massive, inefficient parallel infrastructure required to maintain a semblance of modern life. As the great tech bifurcation solidifies, the global financial system faces a crisis of convergence. We must look at the cross-border settlement risk, the danger that a transaction initiated in one ecosystem cannot be finalized in the other. This is the ultimate liquidity trap. In the Taiwan Paradox, the world realizes that without a unified hardware standard, the network effect that drove the prosperity of the 1990s and 2000s begins to operate in reverse. We monitor the global productivity gap between the two blocks. Historically, when the world splits into rival economic spheres, as it did during the Cold War, one side eventually collapses under the weight of its own internal inefficiencies. The indicator here is the innovation-to-capital ratio. For the individual, the practical insight is platform agnosticism. Relying on a single software or hardware ecosystem becomes a critical point of personal failure. We look at the secondary market premium for cross-platform compatible devices. Individuals who survived the 1990s hyperinflationary environments often did so by maintaining accounts in multiple currencies. In the future, survival may depend on maintaining digital presence across multiple, disconnected hardware architectures. Central banks are forced to act as lenders of last resort, not just for cash, but for connectivity, using swap lines to ensure that essential digital trade can still bridge the gap between rival spheres, even as the Iron Curtain of Silicon descends. As we enter the final stages of the Taiwan Paradox, the focus shifts from institutional survival to the individual resilience framework. We must analyze the dependency ratio, not just in terms of demographics, but in terms of how many external nodes a person relies on for their daily economic existence. In a world of fragmented silicon supply, the most resilient individuals are those who have successfully transitioned to local-first economics. We look at the Energy and Digital Autonomy Index at the household level. This mirrors the survival strategies seen during the 1990s collapse of the Soviet Union, where those with access to dacha gardens and informal trade networks fared significantly better than those purely reliant on state-managed systems. The practical insight for the viewer is the buffer stock strategy, maintaining a physical reserve of essential hardware and tools that can function without cloud-based verification. We monitor the retail inventories of legacy components as they become a form of shadow currency. For the individual, the key is horizontal skill acquisition, the ability to perform tasks across multiple sectors without relying on high-tech specialization. This is the generalist's dividend. In an era where the high-tech ladder has missing rungs, being a jack-of-all-trades isn't a lack of focus. It's a strategic insurance policy against the systemic failure of the silicon-dependent professional world. The individual resilience framework eventually leads to a fundamental shift in how we define wealth. In the peak of the Taiwan Paradox, the traditional price-to-earnings (PE) ratios of the stock market are replaced in the public consciousness by the utility-to-maintenance ratio of physical assets. We observe the resale value of analog goods as a primary indicator of economic sentiment. This is the vintage premium. When a 30-year-old mechanical lathe or a pre-digital tractor sells for more than its modern, chip-heavy equivalent, the market is signaling a profound lack of trust in the future supply chain. For the individual, the practical insight is the non-depreciating skill set. While software languages have a half-life of 5 years, the laws of thermodynamics and basic mechanics are eternal. We look at the vocational wage gap as it narrows. In a world where you cannot buy a new motherboard, the person who can solder a broken one becomes the local banker. This mirrors the social realignment seen in the post-war reconstruction of Europe, where practical trades became the backbone of the new middle class. For the viewer, the strategy is strategic redundancy, owning 2 of every essential tool, 1 high-tech for efficiency and 1 low-tech for survival. We are moving away from the disposable culture of the 2010s toward a generational durability model where the value of an object is measured by its ability to be repaired, repurposed, and passed down through a fractured global economy. The ultimate lesson of the Taiwan Paradox is the realization that total global efficiency was always a hidden form of total global fragility. We must now analyze the economic resilience score of nations and individuals alike. This is a shift from the gross domestic product, GDP, to gross domestic survival, GDS. We monitor the self-sufficiency ratio in critical technology sectors as a primary indicator of a nation's long-term viability. This mirrors the strategic autarky models of the mid-20th century, but with a 21st century digital requirement. For the individual, the practical insight is the community-scale economy. When the global network fractures, the unit of survival shrinks from the nation-state to the neighborhood. We look at the local multiplier effect, the degree to which a dollar spent in a local community stays there. In a silicon-short world, the most successful individuals are those who have built trust-based credit within their local circles, bypassing the need for a functioning global banking mainframe. The Taiwan Paradox has shown us that our high-tech skyscraper was built on a single, precarious pillar. For the viewer, the takeaway is clear. The future belongs to the anti-fragile, those who don't just survive the shock, but gain strength from the necessary decentralization that follows. We are witnessing the birth of a distributed civilization, where the loss of a single geographic node, no matter how vital, can never again threaten the collective progress of humanity. The resolution of the Taiwan Paradox requires us to move beyond the binary of globalism versus isolationism. We must examine the resilience-efficiency frontier, an economic model that maps the optimal balance between a lean, profitable supply chain and a redundant, secure one. This is the new Bretton Woods moment for the digital age. We monitor the diversification index of global chip manufacturing as it finally begins to trend away from extreme geographic concentration. Governments are shifting from just-in-time to just-in-case fiscal policies, creating strategic reserves of silicon, just as they once did for petroleum. For the individual, the thought-provoking reality is that we are the last generation to live in the era of unconscious consumption. The Taiwan Paradox has stripped away the illusion that the complexity of our lives is guaranteed. We look at the social awareness coefficient, which measures how much a population understands the macroeconomic foundations of their daily tools. The practical insight is that the new normal will be more expensive, slower, and more localized, but it will also be more durable. We are trading the flickering light of extreme efficiency for a steady glow of systemic resilience. This transition is not a failure of progress. It is the maturation of a global species that has finally learned to protect its most vital intellectual and physical assets from the whims of a single geographic choke point. The Taiwan Paradox concludes with a sobering message about the nature of modern civilization. Our greatest strength, our connectivity, is also our most profound vulnerability. We have spent the last half-century building an edifice of unimaginable complexity on a foundation as thin as a silicon wafer. As we look at the final economic indicator of this journey, the Global Interdependent Stability Index, we see that the path forward is not about retreating from the world, but about engaging with it more wisely. The lessons of the IMF in 1997, the hyperinflation of Argentina, and the energy shocks of the 1970s all converge here, teaching us that economic survival is a matter of both macro policy and personal preparedness. The individual who thrives in this new era is the one who understands that wealth is not just a balance in a digital ledger, but a combination of tangible skills, community trust, and a diversified existence. We have moved from a world where we ignored the source of our technology to one where we must respect its fragility. The paradox is resolved not when the risk disappears, but when we have built a global architecture strong enough to withstand its realization. As the sun sets over the foundries of Hsinchu and the trading floors of New York, the message is clear. The age of fragility is over. The age of resilience has begun. The future is no longer something that happens to us. It is something we actively secure, one chip, one skill, and one connection at a time. How does this story resonate with you? I'd like to hear your perspective, so feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. If you found this video useful, consider subscribing and giving it a like. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.